The wind clawed at the windows like a living thing, shrieking through the cracks of the old Hale Ranch house. The fire in the hearth burned low, fighting against the cold that crept through every board and nail. Thomas Hale sat near the flames, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee gone cold. He stared into the fire, watching the wood crackle and split, sparks leaping like ghosts trying to escape. Outside, the Dakota plains were buried beneath a blinding sea of snow. There wasn't a light to be seen for miles. Nights like this could drive a man mad with his own thoughts, and Thomas had more than enough of those to haunt him. He hadn't spoken to another soul in nearly a week. The cattle were penned, the horses fed, and his only company was the relentless wind and the fading memory of Clara, his wife, gone 2 winters ago. Her laughter used to fill these walls, now it was just the echo of what had been. He reached for the small picture frame on the mantel, running his thumb over her face. "You'd tell me to stop moping," he muttered under his breath, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You always did." The ranch creaked and groaned with the storm's weight. He was about to throw another log on the fire when it came, a sound that froze him mid-motion. A knock, faint, hesitant, but real. He blinked, unsure if he'd imagined it. Then came another, 3 sharp, uneven raps against the door. Thomas frowned, setting his mug down slowly. No one traveled this far in weather like this. He reached for his shotgun out of instinct, the one that hung above the door. The knock came again, weaker this time, almost pleading. He unlatched the door and opened it against the wind. The blizzard roared into the house, snow swirling in like a ghostly fog. And there, on the threshold, stood a woman. Barely standing, her hair plastered to her face, clothes torn and heavy with snow. Her lips were blue, her eyes glassy and full of fear. She stumbled forward and collapsed against his chest, her body cold as the ice outside. Good Lord! Thomas caught her before she hit the floor, lowering her gently near the hearth. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, her voice a whisper carried on the storm. "Please, help me." He shut the door fast, sealing out the wind, then threw another log on the fire until the flames grew tall and bright. He knelt beside her, rubbing her hands, trying to bring warmth back into her. She looked young, no more than 20, and her dress was little more than rags. A jagged bruise marked her cheek, dark against pale skin. Thomas grabbed a wool blanket from the chair and wrapped it around her, tucking it tight. "Don't talk yet," he said gruffly, though there was gentleness behind the words. "You're safe. You just need heat." After a few minutes, some color returned to her face. Her eyes fluttered open, catching the firelight, and he saw the fear in them, raw and wild. "Where am I?" "My ranch," he replied, sitting back on his heels. "You're lucky I heard you. You'd have frozen solid another minute out there." Her lips trembled as she tried to sit up. "I ran, from them." "From who?" "The stagecoach," she whispered. "They said they'd take me to work in town, but they weren't who they said they were." Thomas's stomach twisted. He'd heard stories before, women tricked into traveling west, promised honest work only to be sold or worse. He stared into the fire, jaw tightening. "They tried to take you." She nodded, shivering. "I jumped off the coach near the ridge. I just kept running. I didn't know where I was going." He poured a cup of coffee and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed briefly, her skin still ice cold. She sipped, hands shaking. "Thank you," she said softly. "I thought I was going to die out." "There, you almost did." He leaned back, running a hand over his stubbled chin. "Name's Thomas Hale. And you?" "Lydia," she said after a pause. "Lydia Brooks." The name fit her somehow, delicate, but with something strong hidden underneath. She looked like someone who'd been through too much for her years. He stood, pulling another blanket from the shelf. "You need to get out of those wet clothes before they freeze to your skin," he said matter-of-factly. Her eyes widened slightly, as if the words carried a meaning she'd been forced to fear before. I can't." Thomas noticed the tremor in her voice, the way her hands clutched the blanket around her shoulders. He turned toward the fire, realizing how it must sound coming from a stranger's mouth. "You'll catch your death if you don't." "But," he faced the wall, his voice low and steady. "I'll turn around. You keep the blanket. Get warm." For a moment, she didn't move. Then he heard the faint rustle of fabric, the soft thud of her soaked dress hitting the floor. His back stayed turned, his eyes fixed on the dancing light on the windowpane. The silence stretched long enough for him to feel the weight of her trust pressing against the air. When her voice came again, it was barely above a whisper. "I'll take it off, just do it." Thomas froze. For a heartbeat, he couldn't move. But then he heard the tremor in her tone, the exhaustion, the fear. Not temptation, desperation. He took a slow breath, forcing his voice calm. You don't have to be afraid here, Lydia. I'm not them. The fire popped loudly, filling the silence. After a few moments, she said, I'm done. He turned around slowly. She sat close to the fire now, wrapped tight in his blanket, her wet hair dripping onto the floorboards. Her eyes met his briefly, full of a fragile gratitude that made something shift deep in his chest. Better? He asked. She nodded. Warmer. Thank you, Mr. Hale. Thomas, he corrected gently. You can call me Thomas. He handed her a small bowl of stew from the pot hanging over the fire. She ate slowly, every bite seeming to pull her further back to life. He sat across from her in silence, not wanting to push, just letting her breathe. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, something fragile began to thaw. Later, when she fell asleep by the fire, her head resting against the chair, Thomas found himself just watching her. She looked so small there, the blanket slipping off one shoulder, her face soft in sleep. There was something almost peaceful about her now, despite the storm still screaming beyond the walls. He turned away, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, a stirring of protectiveness, of quiet purpose. For the first time since Clara's death, he wasn't just surviving the night. He was keeping someone else alive through it, and that meant something. He sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on the fire. The storm would pass, eventually. It always did, but Thomas knew something inside him had shifted for good. He didn't know it yet, but that night, when a half-frozen stranger knocked on his door, was the night he began to live again. Morning came slow and pale across the Dakota plains, the world outside buried under a white silence. The blizzard had spent itself during the night, leaving the land still and cold, every fence post crowned with snow. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, its glow soft against the log walls. Thomas Hale stirred first, the stiffness in his shoulders reminding him that he had dozed in the chair by the hearth again. He blinked the sleep from his eyes and looked toward the rug where Lydia had fallen asleep. She was still there, curled under his wool blanket, her hair spread like ink against the rough weave. For the first time, her face looked peaceful. He rose quietly, added another log to the fire, and went to the small kitchen nook. The smell of coffee began to fill the air, blending with wood smoke and the faint scent of snow that always crept through the cracks. He poured 2 cups and turned just as Lydia stirred. She sat up slowly, blinking, her eyes landing on him. For a moment, confusion crossed her face, then recognition. Morning, he said softly, setting a cup near her. Morning. Her voice was rough, fragile from the cold and fear of the night before. She clutched the blanket closer around her shoulders. I didn't mean to fall asleep. You needed it. He leaned against the counter, watching the wind shift through the frosted glass. Storm's done. You made it through. A small smile touched her lips. Thanks to you. They ate quietly, spooning up hot oats and honey. The silence between them wasn't awkward, just cautious, like 2 people trying to learn where to set their feet. Outside, the ranch was buried in snow. The barn roof sagged under the weight of it, and the corral was half invisible. When Thomas stepped out later to check the livestock, Lydia followed him, still wrapped in the blanket but determined to help. You should rest, he said, tightening his coat. I've rested enough, she replied, her breath fogging in the air. I can't sit still. It makes me think. He didn't argue. She trudged behind him through the drifts, small and stubborn, her boots sinking deep. They shoveled a path to the barn and opened the heavy door. Inside, the horses nickered softly, their breath steaming in the chill air. Thomas moved among them with steady hands, checking feed, water, and blankets. Lydia watched him, her eyes following his every motion, the way he calmed the animals, the quiet way he spoke to them like old friends. You take care of them like they're people, she said softly. Sometimes they're better company, he replied, a half-smile flickering on his lips. She laughed quietly. It was a small sound, but it warmed the air more than the fire had. Days passed like that. The snow outside stayed thick, the trails impassable, and so Lydia remained. She helped where she could, mending clothes, cooking, sweeping the wooden floors. She had a careful way about her, like someone who had learned to keep her movements small and quiet. Thomas noticed it but never pressed her about it. Instead, he gave her space and small kindnesses, warm food, clean water, gentle conversation. At night, they sat by the fire together. She would hum old tunes she half remembered, her voice soft but haunting, and he would listen in silence, sometimes smiling, sometimes lost in thought. The loneliness that had clung to the ranch for years began to fade, replaced by something gentle and living. One evening, while she was sweeping, Lydia noticed a small locket on the mantel. It was brass, worn smooth from years of handling. She picked it up, opening it carefully. Inside was a faded picture of a woman smiling, her face kind and calm. "Your wife?" Lydia asked. Thomas's eyes lifted from the fire. "Clara," he said quietly. She passed a couple of winters back. Lydia closed the locket and set it down carefully. "She's beautiful." "She was," he said, his voice thickening for the first time. She had a way of finding light, even on days when the sky was nothing but gray. Lydia hesitated, then said softly, "You still talk about her like she's here." He stared into the flames. "In some ways, she is." The silence stretched between them, gentle and full. Lydia watched him, her heart tightening in her chest. She saw the grief in him, not sharp anymore, but worn into him like an old scar. She knew that feeling. She had lived her own kind of grief, one that didn't come from death, but from being stripped of trust, of safety, of the life she might have had. When he looked at her again, there was no pity in his eyes, only understanding. "You remind me of her," he said finally. "Not because you look like her, but because you don't give up." She smiled faintly, blinking away sudden tears. "I did give up once," she whispered. "For a long time." He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and steady. "Then maybe it's time you start again." The next morning, she rose before dawn, determined to prove she could work as hard as any ranch hand. Thomas tried to stop her, but she was already outside feeding the chickens, her hair pulled back, cheeks flushed from the cold. The more she moved, the more she seemed to come back to life. She laughed when the rooster chased her, and Thomas couldn't help but laugh with her. Weeks passed. The snow began to melt, dripping from the eaves in slow rhythms. The land beneath the ice started to show patches of brown and green. Lydia had become part of the rhythm of the ranch. She cooked breakfast, tended the horses, and even learned to ride under Thomas's patient instruction. He found himself looking forward to her laughter, her stubbornness, the way she brought warmth into places he'd thought would stay cold forever. Then one afternoon, as they were stacking hay near the barn, a rider appeared in the distance. Thomas shaded his eyes. A man on horseback, wearing a badge glinting in the sun, a lawman. He rode hard and fast, stopping in front of the ranch with snow and dust spraying up from his boots. "You Thomas Hale?" the man asked, dismounting. "I am," Thomas replied, his tone calm but wary. The lawman held out a folded paper. "We're looking for a woman named Lydia Brooks. Escaped property from a man down in Rapid City. Claims she stole a horse." Lydia froze behind Thomas, her face pale. The lawman's eyes caught hers, and she stepped back instinctively, gripping her hands together. Thomas's jaw tightened. "She's no one's property," he said, voice hardening. The lawman frowned. "You harboring her?" "I'm protecting her," Thomas said, stepping forward. "She's been hurt enough." The wind picked up around them, carrying the smell of melting snow. The lawman studied Thomas's face for a long moment. "You'd risk arrest for her?" Thomas met his gaze without flinching. "If that's what it takes to keep what's right, then yes." Something in his voice, steady, unyielding, made the lawman pause. He folded the paper back into his coat and glanced once more at Lydia. "I didn't see her," he muttered finally, turning his horse. "Keep her clear of town for a while." As the rider disappeared down the road, Lydia turned to Thomas, her eyes wet with disbelief. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, voice trembling. "You could have lost everything." Thomas's gaze softened. "Some things are worth losing everything for." For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then she reached out, her fingers finding his, tentative but sure. "You saved my life," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, Lydia, you gave me mine back." That night, they sat on the porch as the last of the snow melted into the earth. The sky was deep blue, scattered with stars. Lydia leaned her head against his shoulder, and he didn't move away. They stayed like that for a long time, saying nothing. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore, it was full of everything they'd both lost and everything they had just begun to find. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a breath. "I never thought I'd feel safe again." "You are now," he said quietly. "As long as I'm breathing, you are." And for the first time since the storm, Lydia believed him.